Warning, this video contains spoilers for Amazing Spider-Man number 26. Yes, the one that's not out yet. If you've been around comic book internet, you probably know that there has been teased for quite some time now a major death in the current Amazing Spider-Man run by Zeb Wells, and at least according to leaks, it appears that that death is Kamala Khan, aka Ms. Marvel. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about that. Over at Dennett Geek, I wrote an article about my problems with superhero death stories in general. Here, I want to talk about the fact that sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, we can get really interesting, character-driven, thoughtful stories out of the death of a superhero. And I want to talk about 5 great examples of those types of stories. Starting with Legion of Superheroes, Volume 4 from 1989 by Keith Giffen and Tom and Mary Beyerbaum. I love the Legion of Superheroes, but it is a difficult property for people to get into for a variety of reasons. The most impenetrable is the 4th volume, also known as the 5 Years Later Legion. Volume 4 picks up again 5 years later, and so there's always that sort of what happened in the interim, what are the gaps, and that's difficult to follow. Another thing that's difficult to follow is now we've gone from a largely optimistic kind of Star Trek-esque future that's in most Legion stories to a dark dystopia, making things even more difficult. This is Keith Giffen on art, and he is at his most impressionistic. But I argue that it is one of the best Legion of Superheroes story precisely because of something that happens in the 3rd issue. In that issue, Roxas the Butcher, who is kind of a B-tier Legion villain, appears and murders Block. Block is this rock man who's got a heart of gold. He's kind of like the Colossus of the team. And usually that sort of thing, murdering a nice character in this grandiose style and then sending his remains to the son of Saturn Girl and Lightning Lad, which is what happens in the book. Usually that sounds like grimdark edgelord nonsense, right? But it's this event that eventually sparks the rebirth of the Legion of Superheroes as adults. After Block dies, these bitter, scarred, traumatized adults realize that their hope still means something, that the values they fought for still mean something, and they reform the Legion of Superheroes even in this dark time. Number 4, Ed Brubaker and Steve Epstein's Death of Captain America storyline, particularly those that start with Captain America number 31 in 2007. This is when, of course, Steve Rogers dies in the Civil War, and he gets replaced by Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier. Now, for those of you that only know Bucky from the MCU, he is very different in the comics. In particular, he started out as a teen sidekick, kind of like Robin in World War II Captain America comics. And basically, Bucky stays dead for decades. And when Bucky comes back, just like in the movies, he's the Winter Soldier, but he's the Winter Soldier for a little bit longer. And so he is much more tainted. And yet, when Steve dies, through a variety of machinations, including a desperate for redemption Tony Stark and a desperate for stability Natasha Romanoff, they make Bucky into the next Captain America. And what follows is a story that is simultaneously questioning Steve Rogers' mission and ideals while also trying to find redemption for Bucky. Number 3, Batman and Robin by Grant Morrison, particularly the issues that run 2009 through 2010 with various artists. Batman and Robin begins after Bruce Wayne is quote-unquote killed by Darkseid in Final Crisis. That leads to a big metatextual, very Grant Morrison storyline called Batman R.I.P. and then the return of Bruce Wayne. I don't want to get into that right now. Instead, I want to talk about Batman and Robin, which is fairly straightforward as far as Grant Morrison goes. And his big pitch is that he wants to flip around the dynamic. So here, Dick Grayson, the first Robin, takes on the Batman mantle. But Dick Grayson is not Batman. In other words, he is not dark, he is not scowly, he is not bitter. He is an acrobat, he is footloose and fancy-free, he is optimistic. And he is teamed with Damian Wayne, trained to be an assassin from the moment he was born, And even worse, he's a 13-year-old boy. And so Morrison said, what if we flip the dynamic? We've got optimistic, upbeat Batman and grouchy, cynical, stoic Robin. And it's great. It's a good referendum on why too dark a Batman is kind of a silly thing. It's heady, but it's also relatively straightforward. And it's just a good, fun look at what Batman can be. Number 2, The Superior Spider-Man by Dan Slott and various artists. So Superior Spider-Man happens when, in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man, Dr. Octopus is dying, and he manages to mind swap with Peter Parker. And so Peter's mind is in his dying body, Octavius's mind is in Peter's young body. And so essentially, Peter Parker dies, and Dr. Octopus becomes Spider-Man. And as the name suggests of the book, the Superior Spider-Man finds Doc Ock basically finding that he is the Superior Spider-Man. He looks at old loser Peter Parker and he says, I can do this way better than he can. Basically, all of that potential that Peter Parker has always had, Octavius realizes it. And he finds out that he's a better superhero than Peter Parker until he doesn't. Slowly over the course of the comic book, Peter's mind, energy, soul, whatever you want to call it, starts to manifest again in Otto's brain. This builds up to this climactic moment in which Otto is fighting against Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, and not only is Norman a better villain than Otto is, but Otto has also been running from trauma and running from pain and trying to hide that. And this leads to a beautiful climactic moment where we see everything that's great about Peter Parker. It's not the power that Peter could get. That's what Otto thinks it is, but that's not what it is. It's his compassion. It's his ability to sit in the pain and the failure and allow that to become kindness that he shows to other people. And so Otto finally has to admit, you are the Superior Spider-Man, and turn that around and give the body back to Peter, which leads to a wonderful moment where Peter makes a quip at Norman Osborn and everything goes back to normal. But the best post-death superhero story is basically any Wally West story from Crisis on Infinite Earths to Infinite Crisis. In between that time, of course, in Crisis of Infinite Earths, Barry Allen dies. It's a wonderful death scene. It's a good heroic death. And after he dies, his nephew slash teen sidekick, Kid Flash, Wally West, takes up the mantle of the Flash. And this very interesting thing happens over the 20 years that Wally is the Flash. Something that rarely happens in serialized superhero stories. Wally has a proper character arc. He begins unsure of himself and also kind of an arrogant jerk, a little bit of a horn dog, especially in the Justice League Europe issues. And by the time he is basically replaced with Final Crisis and then the New 52, Wally had become a family man, a father of two, a devoted spouse, a strong hero, a compassionate hero. And the reason that's so unique is because, scores of writers had handled Wally West. Different editorial regimes, different types of books, and yet somehow they cobbled together genuine character growth in a character. This almost never happens. A lot of those stories are really great. The ones that I'm going to recommend for this, though, is the Return of Barry Allen storyline from 1993 that is found in Flash number 74 through 79, written by Mark Waid with art by Greg LaRocque. In this storyline, it appears that Barry Allen has returned. And while Wally is absolutely happy to see his uncle and mentor back again, it also means that all of those insecurities and fears that Wally thought he had overcome, he has to face them again, because now his uncle is here to tell him how much he disapproves of him. But unlike the Superior Spider-Man, which becomes a referendum on what's so great about the hero who died, the Return of Barry Allen becomes a referendum on what's so great about Wally. And that's the secret to a good character death story. It's not the shock of a character dying, because we're rarely shocked and usually that pulls us out of the story. It's the opportunity to approach a character from a different perspective, to think about heroism, to think about goodness, to think about power, and these stories, I think, do that.